Sudan has the world's largest number of displaced people, and a majority are facing famine. After more than a year of conflict, the fighting is now spreading to other areas. So what will bring an end to this conflict? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the program. I'm Cyril Vanier. The people of Sudan have faced a devastating conflict for a little more than a year now. Millions of people have been displaced, thousands have been killed, and now there's a threat of famine. Aid agencies are warning the nation of 49 million people is at risk of collapsing. Sudan sits in a strategic area of Northeast Africa with 7 other countries sharing borders and resources such as the Nile River. So what are the regional implications of this conflict? And what can the international community do, if anything, to bring Sudan back from a nationwide food emergency? We'll put this to our guests in a moment. First, though, this report from Imogen Kimber.
Sudan has become the world's biggest humanitarian crisis. 18 million people are going hungry.
Time is running out for millions of people, including 3.6 million acutely malnourished children who are at risk of famine, and they are displaced from their lands, living under bombardments and cut off from humanitarian aid.
He added a famine will likely take hold in parts of the country. Some predictions say there could be 500,000 to 1 million deaths. Aid is very difficult to deliver, and when it gets through, it may be looted. Fighting in Jazeera province, dubbed the breadbasket of the country, has worsened, with more than 100 people recently killed in attacks blamed on the rapid support forces. And this means even less food produced. 70% of health facilities in war-affected areas are no longer functional, according to aid groups. And with increasing violence and hunger, there will be more refugees. 9 million people have already been displaced, most internally. But 1.8 million have fled to neighbouring countries: Egypt, Chad, Ethiopia and South Sudan. All this a result of a conflict that began more than a year ago between the army and paramilitary rapid support forces. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan is leading the Sudanese armed forces.
We will not submit, nor will we retreat or surrender until they lay down their weapons. This battle will definitely end with the victory of the Sudanese people and the victory of the Sudanese armed forces.
While Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo is the head of the Rapid Support Forces, once operated by the Sudanese army. A possible genocide has been reported in Western Darfur by the Rapid Support Forces and their allies, killing up to 15,000 people. And intense fighting continues in Al Fasher in North Darfur State, a pocket controlled by the Sudanese army among what is now territory of the RSF and other groups.
One of the things that, to me, captures just how invisible and horrific this war is that we don't have a credible death count. We literally don't know how many people have died, possibly to a factor of 10 or 15. The number was mentioned earlier, 15 to 30,000. Some think it's at 150,000.
Periello also says the conflict is at risk of escalating, with weapons flowing across borders. And for the people of Sudan, there appears to be no end to their suffering. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Time to bring in our guests in Cairo. Amgad Fareid Eltayeb, Executive Director of the Sudanese think tank Fikra for Studies and Development. In Addis Ababa, Dr. Alaaeldin Nugud, a leadership member of the pro-democracy movement, the Civil Democratic Forces Alliance. And in Boston, Alex Deval, Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation, based at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. A warm welcome to each of you. Amgad, let me start with this. Is it possible at this point to say who is winning this war? We're about 14 months into this. Who's winning?
Thank you, sir. Actually, the answer is that no one is winning. This is a war fought between two bad actors who are both losing, and the biggest loser is the Sudanese people. There is a humanitarian catastrophe, the biggest humanitarian catastrophe all around the world. The regular army has been losing ground and regaining ground in some other areas, but it's losing all over. It's all over control over the country. And at the same time, the RSF is a fascist militia that proven itself not to have a project to run the state. There is no any sign of normal life in the areas controlled by the RSF. And in addition to that, the multiplicity of the international initiatives and the competing peace efforts to Sudan have proven to be not futile or not fruitful in bringing an end to the conflict. Everybody is losing, and only this is and suffering is winning in Sudan.
Alaaeldin, I'm going to put essentially the same question to you. When I speak to my Sudanese colleagues, they're telling me that, within their circle of friends and relatives, the general consensus is, the RSF is gaining ground. The RSF has the upper hand. What does it look like to you?
Okay, thank you first for having me here. Yeah, I think what has been said is the truth that the biggest loser in this war is the Sudanese people. A very big humanitarian crisis, large number of refugees, internally displaced people, the famine, was all that you present in your reports. But yes, as you said, when you speak with many of the Sudanese colleagues, they said that the RSF is getting the upper hand on the ground. But the actual question or the important question, who's the beneficiary of this war? Who get benefit from this war? And this always pinpoint to the Muslim Brotherhood or the NCP, the last regime, the dissolved party people, that National Congress Party that was ruling the country for the 30 years, and the revolution was on them, and they get out from power. And these people.
Why do you say they are the beneficiaries of this war?
Yeah, it's a simple question because. They are getting use of this war to put the Sudanese people between the choice of continuing the war with all the atrocities, or they are going back to power. Because in the transition and after the revolution, this party get dissolved from all the social life, from all the institutions, from all the ministries, and their biggest presence in the security sector, in the army and in the police and the intelligence, was about to be also dismantled. So that's why they erupted this war, especially on the framework agreement that was stated clearly dismantling this party from the army and from the security institutions.
You're accusing the supporters. You're accusing the supporters of the former president, who's now jailed, Omar al-Bashir, and who was deposed, of instigating this conflict between the RSF and the army, so that they could ultimately prevail over a subsequently broken country.
Yeah, exactly. This is exactly what happened. They erupted this war. And they was thinking, they have like 4 scenarios in this war. They were thinking of fast victory over in this war, and actually to finish on the RSF, and most importantly, to finish on the civil sounds and the civil coalition. That is the civil political parties and the professional unions. The one was there in the framework agreement, because this framework agreement was of this NCP. The other thing, they fell in this fast recovery, as all of the generals says, like Yasser Atta, it will take 6 hours or days or 2 weeks. And then they go to the destruction of the infrastructure of the country. That is to put the Sudanese in the hell, and to enforce the Sudanese to choose that they can be back on the table to end this war. And then they go for this civil war scenario that's happening right now. And they started to arm all the people and spread the hatred speech between all the Sudanese tribes. So these are the scenarios of this.
Alex, you've been a student of Sudan for decades. Does that explanation that we just hear match with how you look at the situation? Because we are talking about this conflict as a conflict between 2 parties, the RSF and the army. And Alaaeldin is telling us there's a third party that's operating in the shadow to try and be the victor, essentially, after the RSF and the army are done killing each other. I'm paraphrasing here.
So I think the exact origins of the outbreak of fighting some 12, 13 months ago are always going to be contested. There's a counter-narrative that it was actually an attempted coup by General Hemeti of the RSF that was the immediate trigger, and there's no doubt that he has his sights on holding power and putting perhaps a civilian front to that power. But I think the key point is that the fighting is started by destroying the Sudanese state. Now it's destroying the Sudanese people. The question of the survival of millions of Sudanese is in doubt. And as the war has gone on without a credible or an effective conflict resolution process, it has become entangled in regional and now global rivalries. So until recently, I think the argument could be made that the keys to resolving this lay in the Arab world, in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. But now, out of desperation, I think, the Sudanese armed forces has turned to Iran and to Russia, while the RSF is doubling down on its alignment with the United Arab Emirates. And this is making any attempt to resolve it almost impossibly complicated.
We will drill down on the regional tentacles of this conflict, but since you've all mentioned, obviously, that the biggest loser here is the Sudanese people, I do want to highlight this and put this on the map right now, earlier in the conversation. This is, Alex, arguably the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world, right? It is, in numbers, the biggest displacement crisis in the world. There's no debate about that. More than 8 million people have been displaced. Some internally, some have crossed borders and have become refugees. So biggest displacement crisis in the world, but also there's a famine looming for millions of people.
So if Gaza is the most intense episode of mass starvation in the world today, Sudan is the largest by magnitude, the numbers of people affected, the numbers likely to die. And it comes about not just because of the war, but because of the unresolved legacies of previous wars, the people who were displaced in previous wars in Darfur, in the Nuba Mountains, the food crisis and the collapse of the economy, but most particularly the fact that the two key belligerents are both using starvation as a weapon. So the RSF we can characterize as a looting machine. Everywhere it goes, like a swarm of locusts, it consumes everything necessary for survival, leaving the people absolutely desperate. While the army generals on the other side are trying to strangle the RSF by shutting off all material access, all supplies to RSF-controlled areas, in the hope that that will bring the RSF to its knees. And in the process, the Sudanese people are caught, as it were, between a hammer and an anvil, and are descending into famine on a scale that we haven't seen for decades, if ever.
Amgad, both sides, both the RSF and the army, have been accused of atrocities and violations of international law and human rights law. The RSF in particular is notorious for using sexual violence and for using starvation. Why, and forgive me for this naive question 14 months into the conflict, but why? Why do they inflict all this pain on civilians whom they purport eventually at some point in time to govern if they win this war?
Simply, the war is taking place, as I said earlier, between two bad factions. The army is a corrupt state apparatus, a corrupt state institution that have been corrupted by many years of tyranny and involvement in economy and politics. But as well, the RSF it's in nature. It's a fascist militia that was established by al-Bashir in order to protect his reign. By the Muslim Brotherhood to conduct these atrocities in their behalf. Right now, they are conducting the same sort of atrocities by themselves for the sake of themselves. Their perception on how to rule the country is by terrorizing the people, not by winning their hearts. And this is also make me point to one of the factors that's prolonging the war. which is multiplicity of the narratives about who starts the war and who's benefiting from it. The attempt to use the fighting to serve political agenda, like the anti-Islamist agenda, which Alaa mentioned earlier, is over-exaggerating the influence of the Islamists over the army in order to justify to the people siding with the RSF or accepting the RSF as a natural or normal political actor. That this war should end by resolving or dissolving and ending the institutional existence of the RSF completely, and in the same time conducting radical changes and reform within the Sudanese army and state apparatus in general. Without that, we will be just left to some political narratives that will continue, as Alex said, to compete about who started the war. Obviously, Hemeti started the war even before the fairest bullet, and like getting into complicated details and trying to create an alternative reality to what the Sudanese are watching from the atrocities of the RSF, the killing. Just the day before yesterday, the RSF killed over 150 civilians in a small village killed with the Noura
in the state of Jazeera.
In South Jazeera state. And on that, they came with the justification that they were fighting Islamists in that small village. There were 35, according to the UNICEF chief in Sudan, there were 35 children died and being killed by the RSF during that attack. I will have hard time to be convinced that those 35 children were Islamists fighting against the RSF.
Yeah, the RSF said that they were actually fighting the army in 3 camps outside the village that was ultimately attacked. The army and intelligence forces and the local civilian groups that have organized for a few years now in Sudan across the country have said that more than 100 people were killed. The UN says have called for an investigation. And we don't know the exact circumstances of what happened, but there were videos that came out of that attack that clearly showed many civilians had been killed.
This is the problem. This is the problem of the alternative narrative, as I told you, that we don't know exactly what happened. What we know that there is 150 Sudanese civilians killed by the RSF. 35 of them are children. There is no justification for that. There is no way to accept that. And the UN official rhetoric about like, yeah, let's have investigation here, let's have investigation there, is normalizing these crimes and it's leaving impunity, institutional impunity.
Well, they said it was heartbreaking.
To the RSF to continue conducting these crises.
Yeah, no, look, the UN wasn't saying, we're not sure if the RSF is behind this. The UN just wanted more information. They did say that the videos emerging out of that event were absolutely heartbreaking. I haven't heard any voice in this conflict who came out and said, no, the RSF is not behind this, just to be clear about that.
The justification of it is the problem. As I said, the problem is not that the RSF did it or not. The problem is that there are people putting justifying circumstances to what the RSF did.
Alaaeldin, any conflict usually ends when either one side wins or when both sides come to the negotiating table and strike some kind of deal. Do you see either of those options happening? There have been many peace efforts. None of them have come through between the RSF and the army. And it also doesn't look like one side can convincingly win militarily.
Okay, that's an important question. And actually, to answer this question, it's important to have the real and the true narrative that's Mr. Amgad said that it's exaggerated. Actually, it's underestimating the power of the Islamists. The Islamists ruled this country for 30 years. They was the cause of separation.
Right now there are two sides. Right now there are two sides fighting. It's the RSF and the army. They are the ones who are deciding Sudan's future right now.
Yeah, but actually, the most important thing to know the reality of this war and who erupted the war and who is benefiting from this war and who is responsible for spoiling the peace platforms. And this party, which is responsible for spoiling all the peace platforms. Why? Because they don't want the war to end. They don't want an end to this war until they are on the table or until they have a decision on what's happening in the near future or in the long future or the far future of Sudan. And this is the reality. It's not an exaggeration of what's happened. The NCP, the Muslim Brotherhood, ruled the country for 30 years. They infiltrated in the army, they infiltrated in the intelligence, they infiltrated in the social life, in the institutions. So they spoiled the transitional period. They were behind the coup in the October 2021. Yes, it was done by Al-Burhan and Himeti, but Himeti later on said that the coup was a mistake and we should come back by the framework agreement. And the framework agreement was reaching an end, but the Islamists erupted this war. So they are the beneficiary and they can go.
I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. You've made that point. But my question is, let me take this to Alex now. Why have the peace efforts failed so far? It's not like nothing has been done. It's not like there has been no diplomacy. There have been the Jeddah talks mediated by Saudi Arabia and the United States. There's been a peace initiative under Egypt's leadership. There's been Igad, the African regional bloc. There have been discussions in Bahrain. So there have been multiple attempts at bringing the two sides, RSF and the army, to the negotiating table. None of it has worked. Why?
So none of it has worked, and these efforts have actually cancelled each other out. It's been really a dismal failure of, first of all, American and the United Nations diplomacy. The Americans gave the file to Saudi Arabia without a real clear plan of what to do. And very quickly they got one agreement on between the two sides on respecting civilians and providing humanitarian access, which has been a dead letter, hasn't been observed. But then when it became clear that nothing was really happening in this process in Jeddah, others began to pile in. And it's been a failure of African diplomacy. It's been a failure of Arab diplomacy too. I'm of the view, along with many, that the strings are really being pulled here in the Middle East, in the Arab world. The road to peace in Sudan runs through Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, and to some extent even Tel Aviv as well, and indeed Cairo, and getting those players on board and getting a shared understanding of at least minimizing the damage, standing back. Everyone has their favorite horse in this race, but as the race is run, all the riders are falling. And into this area, into this neglect, without any international leadership, the chaos that we are seeing is unfolding, and it's getting more and more difficult with every passing month.
Amgad, what's it going to take? You heard Alex explain, how deeply involved many regional countries are in what's happening in Sudan. The United Arab Emirates has been accused by a UN investigation of supplying drones to the RSF. Iran is now reported to be supplying drones to the other side, to the army, which also has Egypt's backing. Russia is now getting involved and possibly switching sides because the Wagner group was initially reported to be helping the RSF, still are, reportedly. But now the army is dealing with Russian officials to maybe have an arms for port deal, right? Where Russia would get a port on the Red Sea, and in exchange, the army would get Russian weapons. So this is all complicated, and I'm not expecting viewers to necessarily follow every little tentacle of it. But the point is to say there are plenty of countries that have an interest in what's happening in Sudan right now. And the question is, with all of that in mind, how can a solution be found if there are so many diverging interests?
Yeah, I 100% agree with you and Alex. The multiplicity of the international effort has been a factor that prolonged this war, and the lack of plan and the faulty structure of Jeddah that, by the way, reached 11 times a ceasefire agreement, but there was never an implementing or enforcement mechanism. Right now, what's needed is first to correct the entry point, because the entry point to the negotiation has always been the focus on the political agenda and the political agreement. I think this is the wrong entry point. I think we should start by ensuring the implementation of the international humanitarian law, the humanitarian access and delivery of aid, and the protection of civilians. And after that, what we need is a technical ceasefire. And technical ceasefire is a term that means that it is separated from any other political arrangements. And for that, we need an enforcement mechanism and monitoring mechanism. And luckily
What would that
enough,
look like?
that there are these mechanisms that are in place. The East African Standby Force is a force that Sudan is a regional force that Sudan is a member on. And also there is joint forces from the Arab League. And in December last year, actually, the UN Security Council have outsourced the implementation of such efforts to regional forces. So what's needed right now is to have political leadership of the UN and for the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, to use his power under Article 99 and ask the Security Council to issue a resolution, a binding resolution under Chapter 7 to be implemented by these mechanisms to ensure a ceasefire in Sudan. And even after that, it's not time for politics yet. This war has affected the Sudanese social fabric a lot. There is a lot of polarization. There is a lot of ethnic and political polarization in the scene. And we need a serious Sudanese-led effort to mend the social fabric because before we go into a constitutional and established foundational political process that includes everyone except those who committed crimes in Sudan. And for sure that this political process should not include any of the warring parties. As I said, the army needs reforms that depoliticize its structure and maintain it or return it to do its original job. And the RSF needs to be dismantled and end its institutional presence. The problem of the framework agreement that our colleague Alaa was referring to, that it continued to preserve the institutional existence of the RSF. RSF is an appendix to the state apparatus that had the opportunity after the revolution to participate and transform itself. However, they participated in a coup to end or to cut off the transitional period in October 2021. And then after that, they staged their own coup that led to the current war with all the atrocities that they are committing on it. There is no third chance for them.
All right, gentlemen, that's all the time we have for this discussion today. We want to thank you very much for the time you've given us today. Amgad, Fareid, Eltayeb, Dr. Alaaeldin Nugud, and Alex Deval, thank you very much. Thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle, @AJ Inside Story. From me, Cyril Vanier, and the entire team here in Doha, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.